Hello, my name is Chris Ott, and this is part 19 of this series I'm doing on metaphysics. In part 18, I talked about how schools of materialism in the 20th century avoided the really deep problems of metaphysics. And I talked about what materialism is and so forth. And if you need to go back to that, if I repeat that, it's going to take a long time. So I'm just going to go forward with another set of problems with materialism. Materialism, just the skinny of it is that everything is physical. Okay, that things like mental states and so forth, they're not real. They're somehow sort of like you get fooled into thinking you're having them. You're not actually having subjective, conscious, internal experience, which doesn't make any sense, but I talked about that already. I want to go forward, but there's a couple other problems in it. Let's just accept that there's no internal states. It's just everything is on the outside, and how you're perceiving it, I have no idea because you don't have any internal states. So, but let's just go forward because that's how they do it. They just barrel ahead because it's a program to claim that there's no mental side of things. Everything is behavioral or external. Okay. So, but things like experience, internal, no, you don't have that. You can't, for instance, introspect. That's not real. That's just a linguistic confusion. You just act like you're introspecting. Okay, so let me talk about this. There are lots and lots of physical things, too many to name. This is a physical thing, and what do we mean by that? I mean that it has weight, and it has mass, and it has permanence, meaning it doesn't disappear like in a dream. It stays here. If I put it on this desk and I go to sleep and I wake up, it'll still be there. That's what we mean by physical. So you can feel things with your hands. You know, your organs of sense, which are on the outside of your body, can sense physical things. And so that's also a meaning that we have for the physical. That's another sense in which we mean external, because it's out here, outside of our head, So the materialist wants to say that's all there is, these things, and that everything is reducible to these. So even if we're talking about dreams, it's really reducible to brain states, which are physical states. And the subjective experience isn't really occurring. It just looks that way. That's what behaviorism is. And other schools have different names, but they are behaviorism. For instance, linguistic philosophy takes behaviorism for granted, and functionalism is just another rebranding and rewording of behaviorism. And I've already gone over all this. But now I want to talk about two more problems with materialism. We're not going to talk about the mind-body problem here like we did before, or the deep problems that confront it that it has to avoid. We're going to talk about two problems that it does avoid, but that most don't notice that it can't answer. So the first one is let's go back to what's physical. So all kinds of things are physical. This is physical. My scissors is physical. My body is physical. I hardly name all the things that are physical. But there are some things that are not physical, and everybody agrees, and even materialists would agree. They would have to agree. Okay, so one of these is, for instance, abstract ideas that people have come up with, like freedom. Maybe there's some free people and they're physical, but freedom itself is an abstraction. And obviously it's not physical. The freedom. The people who are free might be real, physical, but not the freedom. That's a concept. Okay, so those aren't physical. How they account for them, and they try to solve it with linguistics, but you go study that. But they're not physical. So another thing that's not physical is number. And number is also like freedom or some other abstraction. It's a mental abstraction. There are no numbers. You can't go get a bucket of numbers. Numbers are conceptual. They're entirely conceptual. Now, and mathematicians, they think up very hard to realize the principles of mathematics. They don't go, out archaeologically with a shovel to find the laws of mathematics. They have to introspect and think about them. But let's ignore that for a moment. We're going to get back to introspection. We're talking about numbers. Now, when we talk about anything physical, we can't separate that from the physical laws that govern it. For instance, if I drop this pen here, it's going to fall to my hand. That's the law of gravity. And that is actually describable, that law, in terms of an equation, a mathematical equation, in terms of numbers and ratios that are relative to the mass and the distance and so forth. And you can't describe it any other way except in number. And you can't describe really physical objects except in terms of number, because this thing wouldn't even be able to hold together as a pen if laws weren't holding together the molecules. And those are held together by natural laws. So without those laws, this would there wouldn't be anything here. So if you want to say that everything is reducible to matter, you would have to say, well, matter is kind of reducible to the laws that hold it together. But even if you wanted to deny that, you have to admit there are these laws. So when a materialist goes to explain the origin of the universe, he has to describe that in terms of the known laws of nature that are derived from observing our experience, things in our experience. And those laws, as I said, are describable as equations. So if he's talking about the Big Bang and there's the expanding universe and all that, that's all described, because we're not there, so we're not describing it visually, we're describing it conceptually in terms of the laws of nature that are known. So this section is called Questions Materialism Can't Answer. So there are 3 questions about this. So what are these numbers? They obviously aren't physical, because they don't have those qualities I just described, like mass and stuff like that. And they have great permanence, but they don't have mass. You can't perceive them with any of your external senses at all. You can't get a bucket of numbers. So what are they? Can't answer. It just can't answer. The next one is, how did they evolve? So you're going to describe the universe evolving, and you're going to start with the Big Bang, and all this stuff's going to happen. You're going to tell a long story, but every single bit of that story takes the laws for granted. So they had to already be here. So how did they appear? Where did they come from? And you can't just say they came out of the Big Bang, because that's not an answer. What are they, and where did they come from? How did they? If they were always here, what does that mean? In what sense? They're mental abstractions. So how were there mental abstractions here before the universe, evolved in terms of them? That doesn't make any sense. But there's a third problem. Incidentally, all this is in my book, or at least I hope from my memory. They should be, or I have to rewrite it. They're in my book, The Evolution of Perception Re-Explained. I go over these. Just a quick pitch there. So another thing is, let's take this gravity that I just mentioned, which is a sort of a paradigm case of a natural law. It appears to govern objects like this and all physical objects that have mass. And let's drop this, and it's going to fall. We all know that. I don't even need to drop it. You know it's going to fall because it's a law and you've seen it happen. And so we've become acquainted with that. Well, if we don't know what that law is, or where it came from, but we have another problem. How does that law, and it is a law, it governs objects like this, the folding of objects. How does it govern it? How does it have influence over this? How is this mathematical equation that's a conceptual abstraction cause this to fall like that? How does it do it? It has to be a physical answer, because remember, we're being physicalists. So how did the law, let's put this in Wittgensteinian language, like go back to my first video and you'll see what I mean. At the last 10 minutes I talk about Wittgenstein's description of the connection between language and objects. Here I'm talking about the connection between laws and objects. As in his words, how do the laws hook on to physical objects, right? Because we got to use language like physical things, because hooks are physical stuff. So, how do they? How do they hook on? What are we even talking about? That doesn't even make any sense. In the evolution of perception, the reason I'm saying all this is not just to ridicule materialism. It's because this can be explained in the evolution of perception, how it's able to govern this object. Okay, so, and where it comes from, too, and what it is, too. So all three of those questions are answered in the evolution of perception, which is in 2 of my books, but it is not explained in materialism. It can't be explained in materialism. There is no material explanation for those 3 things. Questions materialism can't answer. Okay, so now there's one more, and then I'm done. Hopefully this will be a short video. I hate these doing long videos. I feel sorry for the viewers. So anyway, the next thing has to do with epistemology. Epistemology is the inquiry into what do we know, how do we know it, knowledge, okay? So some things, you know from observation, others you might know from logic or something like that. But that all falls into epistemology. What is known and how do we know it, if we can know it? And can we know things for sure? Those are epistemological questions. So now, there are these things that we're born with called intuitions. And I'm going to, just like I use gravity as a paradigm case of a natural law, here I'm going to use one intuition as a paradigm case of an intuition to talk about the topic. And that is the intuition of non-contradiction. That is the intuition that we have, and logic is based entirely, really, deductive logic is based on non-contradiction. And that is the idea that if you've contradicted yourself, you've made a mistake somewhere. Something can't be true if you're contradicting yourself. Something can't be both, is and isn't, sort of, It either is or it isn't, all right? That's the basis of logic, the basis of logic, because logic sort of tests to see whether you're remaining within the boundaries of reason. And if you step out, logical laws will point it out. You're making a contradiction, basically. So how do we learn this principle of non-contradiction? How do we learn it? Well, by definition, an intuition is something you don't learn. It's something you're just innately born with. And it's inexplicable. Nobody knows how you know it. But in materialism, that becomes a problem. Because in materialism, the way you would learn, remember, you're just really, perception is only inputs and outputs, like an ATM machine or a thermostat or a computer. You just, there's input and then your behavior is the output, and there are certain biological algorithms, but there's nothing like introspection. So you couldn't have discovered this by introspection, okay? But in the real world, let me explain how you learn the principle of non-contradiction. First of all, let me show that you're born with it. I have a 2-year-old grandson, and he's 2.5 exactly. And he's starting to talk, and he's really, has all his cognitive abilities are functioning great. Now, if my daughter, let's say when he's 3, when he's talking more, and she's telling him something, if she contradicts herself in this little dialogue, a little lesson she's telling him, he's going to point it out. He's going to call her on it, that she contradicted herself, that you just said. Now, she obviously isn't going to, in the next year, teach him the law and principle of non-contradiction. I mean, this is something we got from, like, Immanuel Kant. It's very complicated, like, even to see it. But the way you get taught it in philosophy is as follows. And this, I use an example of how Socrates taught in, for instance, the Meno. So he'll take something that we know intuitively, and he'll lay out a problem and have you solve it, and then you will solve it yourself, and he'll say, see, you knew that. Okay, so he's pointing out that you already have the intuition. He did this with a slave boy who had no education, to prove that the boy knew geometric principles without being taught them, just by thinking about it, because he asked them the questions the right way, and the slave got it. And he goes, wow, you see, you're born with it. So the same with this non-contradiction. You don't get taught it. You can't perceive it, obviously. It's obviously not physical. Again, it's an abstraction. So the way it gets taught is he'll tell Meno's slave, you're right, you get it. But first he tells him to see the problem, and then he will introspect, and then he recognizes that this has to be true. And that's how we discover things that we know by intuition. When you take the problem of can things contradict and still be true, and you introspect about it, you think about it within yourself, and you go over some examples, you come out and go, no, that's impossible. It can't be. So you learn it by introspecting to see it's there. This knowledge is already there. You can't ascertain from the world. I can't take my son. I can tell my son what a scissors is and what it does, but I can't show him the principle of non-contradiction, because it's not physical. In fact, this also is a problem for the functionalist, who especially denies any kind of subjective introspection and wants everything to be like thermostats and ATM machines, where everything's just responses to inputs. It's not true. And all logic, as I said before, is based on laws like the law of non-contradiction. And so if philosophers love to talk about logic, including behaviorists, but they're acknowledging that they have really, they're acknowledging that they've introspected and seen the common sense of these natural innate intuitions that we have, which proves that we do have introspective power, and that it's undeniable without contradicting yourself. And to try to make an argument for why they don't exist, well, then you're using the principle of non-contradiction. You're using the intuitions that you have to try to dispute the intuitions, and it'll never work, because you can't. Nobody does. Nobody does that. Nobody disputes modus ponens, which is the central principle of logic. Okay, that's all I have to say here. Well, I'll see you in part 20, and thank you for tuning in, and take care, and bye-bye.